So it's interesting, isn't it, that we've got two acronyms which are almost identical for these digital projects funded by IMI. And of course, the metaphor of radar is all about being able to detect signal in noise, and that metaphor is very powerful. It's exactly what these two projects are really about trying to do. The digital age generates vast amounts of data. Somewhere there are nuggets of gold to be had, but it's a tough computational task to actually determine the gold from the rest. So radar CNS is about the use of remote technologies, and we call it remote measurement technologies, RMT, looking at whether they could actually predict or avert negative outcomes by providing real-time information on the current clinical state of the patient and predicting future deterioration. So our idea is to test a transformative platform of this kind of remote monitoring, remote measurement technologies in 3 central nervous system disorders: epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and depression. And those disorders were, as it were, the shopping list of our FPA partners in terms of sort of fitting the IMI call. The point I'd like to emphasize is that these technologies are generalizable potentially to practically any disorder you can think of, particularly any chronic disorder. And our ultimate goal is to improve patient outcomes through remote assessment. So and the call as it came up was around the idea that there was a radar topic on central nervous system disorders, but the potential that once a platform had been built, there might be future radar topics around other disorders. So we've heard quite a lot about the digital revolution and the way in which data is accumulating. And I really enjoyed Anthony's talk, and you know, Anthony's optimism, actually, it's fantastic. But it's also very challenging in health. And the thing which, in a sense, you know, in a sense, the disappointment for health is that if you compare my experience of traveling across Brussels or London, I now have a mobile phone in my pocket and I can tell exactly what time the train is. And when I'm traveling across London, I can work out where my next bus is going to come from, how long I'll have to wait, which train I'm going to catch, whether it's going to be late. I can work out my map from walking from A to B. I even know whether I can pick up one of the bikes which you can hire in London and plan my journey across the city. And that's all about, you know, interoperability of lots of different providers, all producing data and making that available. And I don't think that as a patient and as a doctor, and I see patients, there's anything like that kind of revolution in terms of health, in terms of that sort of user experience. We just have not got there. So, and it's worth sort of pausing and maybe a topic for discussion as we go on in terms of what are the barriers for that. Obviously, health is complex, and there are all sorts of vested interests, and there are all sorts of confidentiality issues. But what are the barriers? What are the things which have actually stopped us from being able to do that transformation, that disruption which has happened in transport? Now, that's a pause, and then I think there's the other question which comes up, and I think is a challenge to me as a clinician, is the way in which, you know, when I talk to others in my shoes about bioinformatics, what they think of is the challenge with molecular data actually generates, the big data problem of genomics. And in a sense, this is very exciting, but very yet provided the patient benefit we hope it will in the future. This slide comes from a friend of mine, Ken Kabuto, who was working previously at the Michael J. Fox Foundation. He's now at Transmart. And Ken was the data scientist in charge of the Michael J. Fox Foundation and was setting up a deep and frequent phenotyping study of people with Parkinson's disease. So these are people newly diagnosed with Parkinson's. They're being followed over a period of time. And the study is looking at their progression and predictors of progression. And they collect biomarker data. So they collect blood samples. They will do every omics under the sun on the blood samples. They will do neuroimaging, PET scanning, and so forth. And what he observed, which I think is a really interesting observation, was that if you took all that data from the biological studies and you compared that wealth of data in height, it comes up to the Empire State Building, okay, 380 meters. If you take the data which actually is collected on patients from patients, the data patients tell the doctor's observation, the clinical observation, the cognitive testing, the patient's report on questionnaires, that clinical data came to 0.1 of a micron. Okay? There's an enormous asymmetry between the molecular data and this clinical data. And yet, what is the doctor in the clinic actually basing decision-making on? It is that clinical data. It's that 0.1 of a micron. And is it not possible, is there not ways in which we might be able to enrich and enhance that clinical data to be able to make better clinical decisions for patients and at least grow it so it's a little bit taller than the 0.1 micron because at the moment it's the clinical data which inform clinical decisions. Now, if we think of this conceptually in terms of what happens in real everyday practice, and it doesn't really matter what disorder you're talking about, but I'm a psychiatrist, so let me talk about this as though this is depression. So you've got a patient here, and this patient is doing reasonably well here. They're coming occasionally to their GP with or without complaints of sleep disorder or other symptoms of depression. It might be something else they're coming to. So they're coming to, hang on, I've got to go back. They're coming to their family doctor with those. And then there might be an episode of specialist care, and then there might be sporadic presentations back to the doctor. But what you get there is a lot of unstructured data. So what the doctor's working on is, the person coming to their clinic. Almost invariably, there's incomplete measurement of outcomes. I mean, we are terrible, actually. Medicine generally is terrible in terms of measuring outcomes in a systematic way. It's one of my bugbears. I've got a big project at the moment trying to get routine outcome measurement happening in general hospital settings. And, of course, these time points are entirely related to clinical state. So people don't tend to present to the doctor when they're feeling completely well, unless it's for something routine like a vaccine. But most of medicine is happening when the person's ill. So inferences around what's going on in the health record are difficult to make. This data is complex and messy. In research studies, it's slightly better. You're doing a randomized trial of a novel antidepressant, for example, and you'll have done a detailed baseline assessment, and then the person comes back to the clinic from time to time and you do a clinical assessment, and that's structured, and at least you've got structured data, and at least they're coming at times which are predictable in terms of the information not being dependent on the clinical state. But of course these are snapshots of a clinical outcome, and the data are very incomplete and rather inefficient, and you're oftentimes being asked by a doctor, what is how's your sleep been in the last couple of weeks? And it's probably very heavily influenced on how your sleep was yesterday in terms of how you answer that. So there's all sorts of subjectivity which creeps into these assessments. And I'm sorry about this slide, you won't be able to read it, but it's to remind me to tell the story of in epilepsy. And this is a very interesting study from Australia, from an investigator called Professor Cook, who took individuals with very severe refractory epilepsy, and they were looking at, they implanted an EEG monitor inside the head. Okay, they were monitoring people in real time over the course of several weeks, and asking people to fill out diaries about how many fits they'd had. And even when you're asking people to keep a record of their seizures, the seizure frequency, there was a complete mismatch between the data coming from the objective EEG recording and the person's own self-report. So the challenging clinic, and actually the challenging clinical trials, if you're doing a clinical trial of a novel anticonvulsant, the challenge is you've got this enormous amount of noise. It's very impressionistic in terms of what's going on with that individual. So there's a real problem in terms of, and maybe this is beginning to answer some of the questions I was setting out about why we haven't disrupted healthcare in the same way that transport is. It's complex, it's difficult to collect the information. But one could start doing this, and this is an example, again, from the Michael J. Fox Foundation, of looking at ambulatory data in people with Parkinson's. So Parkinson's disease, for those who don't know it, is a disorder of, effectively a motor disorder where you have difficulty moving your arms and legs, difficulty initiating movements, and you also have tremor. And what this slide shows is how people with Parkinson's could be asked to use a wearable device, and the wearable device, sort of thing you can buy on the high street, is actually being able to monitor activity. And that activity is actually being able to give you a very clear indication of that individual's disease state in real time. So here we have someone who has woken up, has taken some medication. It takes a bit of time for them to start, and that during this period they have what's called an off episode, so they're finding it really difficult to initiate movement, and then it starts kicking in and they start getting movement. And this is the movement which is actually detected from the accelerometer on a wearable device. So here in Parkinson's you've got a very nice indication of being able to actually monitor movement over time. And give an indication of what might be going on in real time for patients. So with Radar CNS, our job is effectively to build a platform to be able to provide that functionality to these disorder groups and to study them. And the idea is that we start off being able to get the data streams working. So it's about building a data collection, management, modeling, visualization infrastructure. And there are a number of components to that, but being able to look at, and the point about this is it has to be generic, right? We're talking about things, the motto is plug and play, so the idea is you could take a wearable device and a smartphone available on the high street and actually see whether they're actually being useful. So we're trying to get away from sort of, novel electrical engineering solutions. It's not an engineering project in that sense. We're actually trying to see what's available in terms of the proprietary products available. And so we're building a data management pipeline, processing and analytics, data visualization platform so that we can feed information back to patients with conditions. And we want to make sure there's maximal interoperability with health systems. So I think one of the other barriers in terms of health informatics is this problem of interoperability and the ability to actually have systems which talk to one another. So we from the outset looking at how we can actually make this work with health records. And critically, of course, the privacy protections in order to maximize patient confidence. So that's one component. A second component is devising clinical studies, and effectively what we're doing is establishing three large clinical cohort studies, taking individuals with conditions, these three conditions, MS, epilepsy, and depression, following them over time, having persuaded them to wear a device, and looking in a conventional way for evidence of relapse or changing clinical state by doing what you do in a clinical trial of asking them those questions, but then seeing how well the data streams from the devices we're asking people to wear and their smartphones are actually impacting on their, whether they're actually predictive of the clinical state. But the third component is absolutely critical because we are asking a lot of people with various conditions. We're asking people to trust the healthcare system to actually know a lot more about them in terms of their day-to-day life and their lived experience. And so the crucial part of this is actually engaging patients and having a whole range of work. Well, we've got a specific work stream on patient and public involvement, which is around trying to ensure that what we do is acceptable and that we try and foresee the difficulties people may have as early as possible. We're doing similar work around clinicians because obviously clinicians are going to be end users of these sorts of technologies as well. It has to be relevant. We have to identify signals which are of relevance to clinicians, and of course there's a risk with this sort of technology that what you do is generate a huge amount of false positives. You alert clinicians all the time to the fact that something's going wrong, whereas actually this actually creates a lot more work. So you have to be able to find a system which balances that. And finally with regulators, because clearly We don't know what the regulatory environment is going to be like, and we don't know what it's going to be like in 5 years' time, clearly, in terms of this. So we have a work stream which is around regulation. This is who we are. So it's led by King's College London and Janssen with a range. And this, in a way, it doesn't matter the details. The point is that to do a project of this nature, it has to be a large collaboration. We have to bring in the FPA partners and the academic partners and the clinical centres, but we also have to bring in digital industries, and we're very lucky in having Intel and Software AG as partners in this. This is our management structure, which I won't dwell on. You didn't come here to look at organisational charts, but again, it makes the point that we have a carefully structured management, because we have to have good oversight over a highly complex project. This is more functionally what the project looks like in terms of how it operates, and we have a number of different work packages which I've organised. Oops, I keep doing this. I'm sorry. I've organised into clusters, and the clusters really deal with the different components which I've talked about. So at the top there is a cluster around translation, which is about patient involvement, the clinician involvement and engagement, and the regulatory components, so how this will work in real life. There's a technical platforms cluster, which is, I'm being drowned out, a technical platforms cluster which is around that, the big data storage, acquisition, integration, analysis. And there's the clinical disorders cluster, which is around these 3 different work packages, each focusing on a different clinical disorder. But critically, actually, is this component here, which is all around harmonization, because what we want to do is make sure that the platform we develop and the methodologies we use are as close as possible to, as transportable as possible. This slide reminds me that we also have a very important groups which are around the Scientific Advisory Board. You'd expect us to have a Scientific Advisory Board, but the Patient Advisory Board, which is, again, critical in terms of making sure that representatives from the different diseases we're looking at are there at the table right from the outset and being able to give feedback. It's about actual knowledge of lived experience as well as building trust. I think it's actually that kind of, in our first meeting, this advisory group were coming up with ideas we just hadn't thought about. It's incredibly helpful. And we also have an ethics advisor because of the particular issues, I guess, around privacy, which are essential. So I'm going to skip over the next 3 because I can see my time is running out and I will end up repeating myself. But if this works, oh my goodness. No, it didn't work. That's very disappointing. I wanted to show you a slide of the architecture, and I'm not sure why the picture hasn't come up, and that's a sign of my digitally compromised state of play. But we at the moment are developing a platform which puts together various different components of open source technologies, which will allow that acquisition, integration, analysis, and both. So we have to do the analysis both as a sort of static, traditional analysis. You've got the data, you analyze it, but also the streaming analytics. So we have to actually be able to detect signal in real life. We're going to need these systems to detect signal in real time. And our partnership with some of the tech partners, particularly Software AG, which is a software company which has a lot of experience in terms of using streaming analytics for example, spotting trends in finance, is very useful in terms of devising that. But then also at the far end is the end user component. I apologize for the failure there, and I'm going to skip this because it repeats what I've already said in terms of the clinical work packages. But what I wanted to end up with is just a sort of taster of the kinds of things we're doing. This is from another project, so we haven't yet started collecting data on radar, but it gives an indication, and this is, in a way, a proof of concept project called SleepSight, which was established in the Biomedical Research Centre where I work. And the idea is actually looking at these sorts of technologies in people with psychosis. And the critical point was that, psychosis, often relapses in psychosis are, insomnia is a sort of predictor of relapse in psychosis. And we see frequently that you see changes in sleep and circadian rhythm in people with psychosis before a relapse. So the question was, could one actually use these sorts of technologies, and we used a Fitbit, to detect changes in clinical state. I'm not going to show you, I'm not going to answer that precisely, but I'm going to show you what this ends up looking like. So you have an active component where people are talking to their smartphone, putting data in. This one is actually something about the clinical state, like I have heard voices, how much were they affecting you, and so on. So symptom questionnaires, which are part of this, but also the passive component, which was effectively getting sleep data out of a Fitbit, which we know you can do, because if you buy a Fitbit, that's the sort of information it provides. And that's taking stuff like motor activity from it. The optimistic point, and I was a bit skeptical about this, because if you think about this, you've got a group of people who have a chronic illness which is characterized by being suspicious, paranoid, feeling that they're being watched. These sorts of symptoms you might imagine would stop people from participating in a project of this nature. The good news is that actually when we followed people over time, and this was done for a good month, we found that actually the wear time, people were prepared to wear the devices, they completed the sleep diaries, and the symptom diary was completed as well very satisfactorily, and we had an overall adherence to the project well above our target. So our hope is that we can persuade people in the clinical studies which are being proposed in RADAR CNS to take part. That's us. You've seen our website already. It's there. You'll Google it. This is us at our first meeting of RADAR CNS in Brescia earlier this year. It was 1 week before Brexit. I couldn't tell you how unhappy I was on that day. The following week, it was a terrible kick in the teeth to those of us trying to establish these sorts of consortia across Europe. Thank you.
So I think we have time for one question, but it's Matthew will be on one of the panels later this afternoon, so if we can take one from the floor quickly whilst the music's playing in the background. Otherwise, again, opportunity to put questions to Matthew later on in today.
I try to be quick. I think your slide that compare molecular data and clinical data is very good. And I think part of the reason why there's a huge growth in molecular data came from 2001, when European Bioinformatics Institute established gene ontology. After that, we remove all the redundancy data within the molecular data, and from there we can really multiply very fast. And therefore, I think for clinical data, we have to address many of these unstructured issues, how to map the expert professional diagnosis system and the layman's streetwise description of their feeling. And so we have, if we can get European Commission to champion this direction, and then we can start to get more structured data from clinical setting to all the way to app development. And then we don't have to spend a lot of time doing radar, looking through the nugget, the gold from the noise. We go straight from high quality data for data science.
Thank you. I agree. I think that the challenge is, I suspect that a lot of the emphasis in precision medicine is around these technologies, right? The molecular technologies. And I just think that we don't want to have a situation where the kind of clinical phenotyping is playing catch up all the time. I think that this is an area where I feel very strongly that there's a huge amount of information which just is not effectively harnessed for patient benefit.